Amat merat ike tesolderat igmerut.
In Plato's the Meno, we find Socrates locked in discussion with the titular character, with the discussion centering around the topic of virtue. Part of that discussion includes the very topic of this series of videos, whether virtue is knowledge. Socrates begins by prompting Meno for a definition of virtue, one that suits and defines all instances of virtue. The conversation between Socrates and Meno begins with Meno obliging Socrates' line of questioning, but the conversation soon breaks down. After several of Meno's definitions are rejected by Socrates, we see Meno lose his temper and become eager to get on with the actual topic of discussion. This video will make no such mistake, and will heed Socrates' wise advice by attempting to give a solid definition of virtue before moving on to discuss whether or not virtue is knowledge. After all, without a good definition of virtue, we increase our chances of giving an incorrect answer to the question of whether virtue is knowledge. As can be seen by the age of Plato's text, the Meno, the discussion surrounding virtue is one that has existed for a very long time. We can find discussion dating back as far as Plato, and as recent as Rosalind Hursthouse. This video will explore the various historical and modern definitions as put forward by philosophers like Plato, Aristotle, Roslyn Weiss, and Rosalind Hursthouse, among others. In the Meno, Socrates argues for the idea of finding a unitary definition that describes all instances of virtue. While we will be exploring the various definitions, it is not for the purpose of creating a unitary definition, though we will be looking for any commonalities among them, and using any commonalities to explore the idea of virtue as knowledge. Another reason for exploring each is to find any definitions that do not fit the idea of virtue as knowledge, as well as getting a grounding for the reasoning behind Roslyn Weiss's argument, who argues that virtue is not knowledge, but instead a kind of informed opinion. Just as this series of videos open discussing Plato and Socrates, so too will the discussion about the definition of virtue. As stated in the opening video, in the Meno we find Socrates and Meno discussing the idea of virtue. The dialogue opens with Meno asking Socrates how one acquires virtue. As is standard, Socrates denies that he holds any such knowledge, because he does not have knowledge of what virtue is. Socrates then offers to have a discussion with Meno in order to see if they can discover what virtue is. What follows in Plato's dialogue is a long discussion starting with defining virtue and building up to the acquisition of virtue. Meno then attempts to define virtue 3 times, with each definition being rejected by Socrates. One might wonder why rejected definitions are relevant to the discussion at hand, of course. It is the reasons that Socrates rejects them that it is relevant. They are rejected by Socrates because they show us what virtue is not. The definitions that Meno offers up include ideas such as the acquisition of fine things and the management of duties for men and women, arguing that there is a different kind of virtue that exists for both men and women. Meno argues for virtue being activities and acquisitions. Socrates rejects these definitions from Meno, arguing that virtue is not what we do, it is how we do it. For example, in the case of the acquisition of goods, Socrates argues that we can gain the same goods through dishonesty and injustice as we can through being honest and just. But in the case of the former, we would not consider the acquisition to be an example of virtue. It is the latter that we would consider to be an example of virtue. Socrates then also goes on to use arguments to show that this applies to all, male and female, young and old, free and slave. From this, we are led to the idea of a unitary idea of virtue, one that applies to all agents, and is not the description of various kinds of actions. It is instead the manner in which the actions are done. According to the conclusion that Socrates reaches, virtue can be found in actions that are performed with justice, honesty, temperance, and other virtues. By the end of the attempt to define virtue, Socrates is unhappy with the definition they have reached. For what has been reached is not a single unitary definition of virtue, but instead virtue has been broken down into various parts. It has been broken down into a list of virtues. While Socrates may be disappointed with this resolution, for now we can be satisfied that through the dialogue between Socrates and Meno, we have learned that virtue is to be found in the way that we perform various actions. It is not what we do, but how we do it that brings about virtue. This is a theme that we will see as common in all the definitions that follow, and we will also address the cause of Socrates' disappointment. The next definition of virtue we'll explore comes from Aristotle and can be found in his work The Nicomachean Ethics. Aristotle defines virtue as a habitual disposition concerned with choice, lying in a mean relative to us, a mean which is determined by reason, by which the person of practical wisdom would determine it. To expand on this a little, Aristotle breaks habitual dispositions into two categories, either erotai, virtues, or technai, skills. Technai refers to trained skills such as carpentry, playing the piano, martial arts, and the like. Aristotle also believed that we can also train in moral virtues. There is an important difference between the two for Aristotle. In the case of technai, we need only see the quality of the work in order to assess the skills of the carpenter or the pianist. However, with the erotai, we cannot simply look at the action in order to conclude that somebody has acted virtuously. Instead, we need to understand the thought processes behind the action. It is not enough to see the agent behave with honesty in Aristotle's account, as that agent may simply be copying somebody else, or may be acting honestly in order to deceive at a later date. So here we see an addition to the definition given by Socrates in the Meno. We see Aristotle including action towards others in his definition of virtue, but it is more than simply the action along with a property such as honesty or temperance or justice. We also see the addition of understanding why the action had to be done with honesty or temperance or justice. There is also the idea of it being habitual behavior. When we call someone bad-tempered or dishonest or unjust, we do not do this simply based on a single instance where they may have lost their temper, or been dishonest, or behaved unjustly. No, we call someone these things when there is a pattern of that kind of behavior, when they habitually lie or habitually get angry. In Aristotle's account, the same applies to virtue. An action is not considered virtuous if it is just a single action. Instead, it must be a pattern of behavior. An agent is not considered to be a virtuous agent unless they perform virtuous actions habitually. So, from Plato and from Aristotle, we have seen that virtue is performing certain kinds of interactions with others and performing those actions with certain traits such as honesty, justice, and temperance. However, as Aristotle argues, it is not enough to simply behave in that way. The agent must also understand why behaving that way is virtuous, and the agent must also behave with that habit, with a pattern of regularity. Just as the ill-tempered person is considered ill-tempered because they react angrily with a degree of regularity, the virtuous agent is the agent that behaves virtuously with regularity. We are still left with Socrates' disappointment to deal with, though. We are left with Socrates' complaint that definitions such as these have broken virtue into parts. For this, we move forward to more recent scholarship in the venue of virtue ethics, beginning with Christine Swanton. In her work, The Anatomy of Virtue, Swanton gives us a straightforward and simple definition of virtue. In The Anatomy of Virtue, we find Swanton describing it as so. A virtue is a good quality of character, more specifically, a disposition to respond to or acknowledge items within its field or fields in an excellent way. Here we see once again that virtue is within the realm and remit of how we respond to certain situations and the way that we respond to them. Swanton gives us some examples of how to consider certain ideas within the realm of virtue. For example, courage is the concern of dangerous situations, or temperance can be considered as part of the concern of bodily pleasures. Certain virtuous traits deal with how we respond within certain situations. What does Swanton mean when she discusses items being within the field of virtues? This will be expanded upon later when exploring the idea of whether virtue can be considered knowledge. Another example of virtue ethics in recent scholarship comes from Rosalind Hursthouse and her work on virtue ethics. Here we find Hursthouse exploring criticisms levied against virtue ethics in general. And through these criticisms levied by consequentialists and deontologists, we see her bring about a fuller definition. One of the criticisms that Hursthouse addresses here is the idea that virtue ethics, being an agent-centered rather than action-centered ethical system, cannot address the idea of what a right action would be in any given circumstance. In response to this, Hursthouse gives a description of right action according to virtue ethics. An action is right if and only if it is what a virtuous agent would characteristically do in these circumstances. Hursthouse expands on this by defining a virtuous agent as one who has and exercises certain character traits, namely the virtues. This, of course, leaves open the question of what the virtues are, to which Hursthouse responds with the idea that a virtue is a character trait that is on the following list. This may seem unsatisfactory, but as Hursthouse argues, this should satisfy someone like the deontologist or the act utilitarian, who argue that behaving morally is behaving according to a list of duties or rules. However, what are these character traits that one should add to the list? Well, we could go back to Plato here and simply argue that virtues are character traits like honesty, justice, temperance, and courage. Those character traits that we find admirable in another. We could also argue here a Humean version, that a virtue is a character trait that is useful or agreeable to its possessor or others. We could also choose a more Aristotelian approach and argue that a virtue is a character trait that an agent needs in order to achieve eudaimonia, a character trait that one needs to flourish and live well. How do we determine what these character traits are for eudaimonia, though? This question is one that will be explored later, as it is an epistemological question and one that is connected with the overall question of this series of videos. It is also on that question that we will finish this opening video. This opening video has explored various definitions and ideas of what virtue is, both classical and contemporary. While it has left open some epistemological questions, these questions will be explored in later videos. These epistemological questions are centered around the relation between knowledge and virtue, and as such will be examined in greater detail. This opening video was simply a quick exploration of what virtue is considered to be. So what can we conclude about virtue moving forward? According to the various ideas surrounding virtue, we have found that virtue is found in the way that we respond to certain situations. It is found when we respond with honesty, temperance, courage, kindness, and similar positive traits. Virtue is not found in single actions, but instead in habitual behavior. Just as an agent is not described as ill-tempered simply based on a few angry reactions, but on a pattern of responding angrily. An agent cannot be said to be virtuous simply based on a few courageous actions or a few examples of honesty. An agent must understand why it is virtuous to respond in the manner that they are in the situation that they are in. It is not enough for the agent to simply be copying another person they believe is virtuous. Some understanding is necessary. A virtuous agent is one that is in possession of and habitually responds with character traits that are described as virtues. These points were all common to the various definitions and arguments about virtue as put forward by Plato, Aristotle, Swanton, and Hursthouse. These points were also important to the epistemological question with regards to virtue and knowledge, and will be explored in a further video. The video that follows next is a look at the Aristotelian account of virtue and its consideration as a form of practical wisdom through the work of Gerald J. Hughes and John McDowell.